Hello, Endersword here again, this time with a crewing update. There has been a lot of changes to the game in the past year or so, and a lot of things that used to be the conventional thinking of how you would set up an Armada crew have really changed over time, and the new types of weapons that we have available to us, some of the new officers, and just some of the new mechanics in the game have really changed how you want to set these things up. So given that we've got these new formation armadas now, we've got the new Borg poly whatevers going on and a lot of new things out there, I figured it was a good time to address this because I see a lot of people using crews that are kind of some of the traditionally good ones, or they're trying to use some of the new officers in a way that kind of seems like it should work, but maybe doesn't quite pan out the way that they're looking for, due to the way that they're either described or interacting with each other. So I wanted to kind of give some of the examples against a standard target. So it's going to be me hitting one of the FKR solo armadas in 6-star space. So pretty much anything that works against most of the normal armada types is going to work against this. So I'm going to use the same ship setup against the same target over and over. And I tried each of these 2 or 3 times to kind of get an average of them and report back what the findings are. And then I'm going to try and talk about how the officers interact with each other and why we're choosing each one. Basically, what do they contribute to the final equation here? So to kick things off, I'm going to start with a bit of a benchmark here. This is one of the most popular crews currently out there, and I think largely one of the best that is available. So I'm going to go through what the crew actually is, and then one time I'm going to go through the below decks, but largely you can assume I'm using this same below deck setup throughout the rest of the officer tests. So we'll go through that. Here, what we've got is Cisco, Miles, and Gwen DeMarco. The purpose of Cisco in this crew is to provide critical damage or critical hit chance. So his officer ability is going to be increasing the critical hit chance that you have by a certain amount per round as you're fighting against the target. His captain ability is going to be the mitigation. So basically your own survivability in this, he's going to increase your own defensive stats to ideally get them up to the maximum 71.2% mitigation against your target. He's got a synergy with Miles, so that's going to help out with the amount of mitigation that he does. And Miles here is going to provide extra shots. So the way that he works, and I find that he's one of the most confusing sounding officers in the way they wrote his officer card. Basically what he does, every round, you flip a coin. There's a 50% chance that he is going to provide 100% extra shots for the next 3 rounds. It's written in a really weird way, but basically that's the way it works. Round 1, you're going to flip a coin. If it's heads, then you're going to get 100% extra shots, and that's going to last 3 rounds. Round 2, flip a coin again. If you get heads again, it's going to add another 100%, and round 3 will add another 100%, and each of those coin flips will last for that 3-round duration. So the average that he's going to give you most of the time is 1.5 correct flips out of those 3 rounds. That's going to give you basically 150% extra shots, or multiplying the damage that you do by 2.5. So you get your normal shots plus you get your extra. You can get a little lucky with him, you can get a little unlucky with him. That's why I tried to take an average over a few fights to see where we're at. DeMarco is going to be here largely to provide, well, only to provide isolytic damage. She is the biggest isolytic damage officer by far for armadas, and she's also amazing for PvP, but that's something else. But basically, she, even at tier 1, I think it's 70% isolytic damage that she's doing. I know this is an officer not everyone has unlocked yet, but some of you may be close. There's been a few events around it. You can pick her up in the Invasion store when that's available. She's definitely a really good one to get, and hopefully this is going to demonstrate why. But her ability to add isolytic is going to add so much to the damage that we have available to us. To go through the below decks here, we've got 2 officers bookending here that are designed to add critical damage. So E. Troy is going to add critical damage. Every time we do a crit, we're going to crit for a higher amount. So there is a multiplier that is basically you fire a shot, a dice rolls to say whether you crit or not. And we want that chance to be as high as possible. Once you've successfully critted, then it's going to multiply that damage by a certain damage multiplier, which is your crit damage rate. E. Troy increases that, and Odo increases that below decks. E. Troy does it for both Armadas and Hostiles as well. And Odo actually works against everything. He even works in PvP. So that's why they're there. This one, Vael or something, I forget her first name, whatever it is, the officer that they just kind of made up from Symbiosis, she increases the likelihood of you hitting a critical chance each round as well. So basically Cisco and her are going to be working together to increase the likelihood of you critting. And the longer the fight goes, the more that's going to increase until you eventually get to 100%. The 3 officers from Voyager here in the middle are here to apply status effects. So when they're maxed out, they each have a 100% chance of applying burning, morale, and hull breach to the target. And then that percentage obviously goes up as you tier it up. But when you max it, it's 100. Basically, the main purpose of this, burning kind of hurts your target. It hurts it 1% per round. But the main purpose and reason we want it on is because of the new Nova Squadron building and associated research that increases the amount of isolytic damage that we do to a target if it is burning. And there are artifacts to that effect as well, other things that will increase that. So we want the target to be burning so that we're doing extra isolytic. Similarly, we want to have morale because it will also give us extra isolytic. The best one, if you had to pick one of the 3, is going to be Torres, because the hull breach not only gives us the extra isolytic similar to the other 2, but actually takes our total amount of crit damage and multiplies the entire thing by 1.5. So whatever your critical damage rate was, she just takes that and adds 50% to it right on top, which is gigantic, really, especially as that number gets higher and higher. So I'm going to use this same below decks in most of the cases. So just to explain that once, what they're for, there's a few other little options that you could have in here. There is another Voyager officer, Tom Paris, which is going to improve your mitigation. So you could swap out maybe Odo for that extra mitigation if you're finding that you're really not holding up well to a target. But in this particular case, we've got Cisco that should be providing all the mitigation that we're going to need against this target. So if we look at the summary here, the fight took us 2 rounds to kill the target. We took 21 shots, so that's going to be my metric a little bit for how long the fight is, as opposed to how many shots we do, because some of the officers will multiply the number of shots we do, so it's not a good indicator. But if you win, say, halfway through a round versus it takes you all the way to the end of the round, then you're going to take less shots. So you're basically taking less damage. So in this case, 2 rounds, 21 shots that we took. We had a 74.5% crit rate. That's going to continue to go up each round, but this is a relatively short fight. Our ISO multiplier, which is going to take the normal damage we do and multiply it by this amount. So basically your normal times 10.31 is going to be how much ISO we do. And over the duration of this fight, we took 194 million hull damage to us while completely killing this target. And largely this is kind of going to be a metric of success. There's kind of 2 things that we're looking to get out of this. One is how much damage output are we doing, because that's often a metric when you're there with a group. Like this is obviously a solo, but when you're there with a group, it's how much are you contributing to that group, how much are you helping kill that target quickly, and then also how much are you surviving. If you're out there trying to do 20 Dominion solos in a row, you're out there trying to do a bunch of group armadas in a row, you don't want to go redock and you don't want to have a high repair bill. So basically what's going to help you survive the most? So in this case, we've got a really quick fight and we only took That may seem like a large number to some people, but you can see it's a small fraction of what the cube is. 194 million hull damage. What I want to look at is what would this crew look like if I just got rid of the below deck. So just to make the point of how impactful that part is, because I'm going to be using the same below deck setup in each of the examples, basically, unless I say I'm not, then I want to just show the impact of same crew above deck, but I'm going to replace the below deck now with just stat officers. These guys don't do anything, but they just give the stats to fill out the ship. So you've got the max numbers on the side, whatever, but none of them have any special ability while they're in the below deck. So basically, I just want to lay that as a baseline. I'm doing Armadas on the side, like literally right now, just to compare that. So in this case, if I just take off the below decks and I fight the exact same target with the exact same officer setup above, it's now taking 4 rounds. I'm now taking 57 shots instead of 21. My crit rate has dropped from 74 to 54 because I no longer have an officer providing an extra percentage to the bottom. The ISO multiplier that I've got has fallen by over 200. So even though those ISO Voyager officers, or the status effect impacting Voyager officers, should be adding like 60 to like 80 or 90%, depending on your artifacts, things like that. In reality, they're reducing it by like 215, basically. So why is that? And that's because your ISO damage gets multiplied basically by your ISO cascade. They're multiplicative, they're not just linear. So when you lose like 90%, you're in reality losing like 200 to 300%, depending what your other things are. So in this same fight, losing them is going to cause me to take 563 million hull damage instead of 194. So double the amount of time that it takes, and I'm taking more than double the amount to my hull because of how much longer it took to kill the target. So I wanted to also then compare to the absolute baseline example. If we take this same cube, which is at 11.1 billion, and just put basically next-gen Crusher on it, just an officer that does nothing to help you in any situation. If you've ever seen that episode where Crusher is stuck on the Enterprise alone in a warp bubble or something, just imagine that's what's happening. No one's below deck, no one else on the ship, and she's not helping at all. We fight that same target, and now instead of killing it in 2 rounds, we are dying in 12 rounds. So we're barely harming this thing, and it is completely annihilating us in 12 rounds. We took 210 shots. Our crit rate, which was at 74%, is now at 29.6%. Our ISO, which is just kind of the base ISO damage I have, is 336%. And we obviously took 11.3 billion hull damage, and we blew up. So basically, the ship, and this is one of the main points I want to make, the ship doesn't carry anything. The ship sucks. The ship does what the officers tell it to do. And if you don't have the officers activating stuff for your ship, then it is so much weaker than you think it is. And the reason that I bring that up is because you probably see this a lot. You see people show up to your armadas, most likely, whether it's formations or groups or whatever, where they've probably just gone with the crew that they were hostile grinding with. So they just had a crew out that they were doing something, an armada pops up, they call in, they come on over without going home to redock it first. And they're just now going to bring to you whatever hostile setup they have, whether it's E-Picard, E-Data, and 5, which, you know, would get them some extra loot on the 5 part at least, or they may come with Pike Moreau Chen, or they may come with Pike Moreau E-Data, or whatever, and their below decks is largely set up to fight hostiles. In this case, Odo does work against armadas, and Tom works for mitigation against armadas, but the rest of these, Chapel doesn't do anything, Hugh doesn't do anything, whatever. So I'm just kind of giving an example of this is a hostile grinding setup that I would use. But if I just brought this from the hostile zone to the armada, then how would it perform? And it basically performs as if this ship is empty and Crusher is sitting in the bridge. That's basically what it does. So it's not providing the benefit that you want it to. So just saying my ship is so big that it can't fail, yeah, that's true in some cases. But if you're fighting some stuff that is kind of on the cutting edge, new content, things like that, and you just figure my ship's power is going to carry me, the important point to know is that your ship's power is very, very, very small part of the equation. It is a fraction of the equation, and the activated abilities are really the thing that's going to kick you off here. So again, in this one with this setup, we've got very, very similar numbers. Our ISO's 336, our crit rate's right around 30%, and we died in 19 rounds this time instead of 21 or whatever. Or 19 rounds instead of 12, I guess. This is because Tom Paris does work. So you have mitigation, whereas the first one didn't. But basically, none of these other ones really do anything in the combat. So either way, you're just going to die. But some people actually intentionally do this because stuff like 5 gives them an extra cut of the loot, and unfortunately the loot division is not based on how much you contribute, how much damage you do, whatever. It's just based on the power of your ship. So very often people just put in the powerful ship and don't really crew it well, so they're not really contributing the amount that their power number should indicate. So another example of a viable one, if you don't have Gwen, because a lot of people certainly don't yet, something that you can work towards, but is to swap out Janeway for Gwen. So again, we're keeping Cisco, we're keeping Miles for the same reasons, but Janeway also does isolytic damage, just quite a bit less of it, but it's still an impactful amount, and it works against armadas. So in this case, not too much worse. We're surviving. Or I say surviving, this time we win. It takes us 3 rounds to kill the thing. We took 42 shots in the fight. We have a 79.2% crit rate, so that extra round means that our crit rate went up a tiny bit more. Our ISO multiplier is certainly a lot less than it was with Gwen, but it's certainly a lot more than it was if you've got none of these officers on at all at 601%. And we took 375 million hull damage, so certainly a fair bit more than with the Gwen choice, but not too bad. We didn't blow up or anything. So this is still a very viable crew. If you don't have Gwen yet, this was kind of the main meta crew for quite a while until she became an available officer, and then people got switched out for that. But this was largely what I used for, probably like a year or something before she came around. Another one that you see a lot of people using, because this is how the crew was originally released back in the day, was this Changel Kira crew that you've got Cisco, Miles, and Changel Kira. Changel Kira provides synergy to the Cisco and originally had a fairly reasonably good ability. Changel Kira lowers the mitigation of the target. So basically, this used to matter a lot more before isolytic existed. And now it's kind of moved out of the meta because so little of the damage you do is actually normal damage that can be mitigated. It is now isolytic damage that cannot be mitigated by most of your targets. So in this case, each round, she would take a percentage and lower the mitigation of the target. So originally you may have started with, say, 40% of your damage getting past the defenses of the Armada and then hitting their shields and hull, whereas you would then over time take that down. Each round it would be less, and then you get 45% through, 50% through, 55% through in order to hit that. There's a complex curve around that. This isn't important anymore. One, you don't really need her to boost the Cisco mitigation stats. They're already pretty high anyway, especially with Miles there already for synergy. So it's not really helping your defense too much. And like I said, the defense of the target is irrelevant largely because the vast majority of damage you do now is going to be isolytic damage. So you're going to fire, if you fire 1 million points of normal damage, then you're going to fire 4.37 million points of isolytic damage. the normal damage is going to get mitigated. The isolytic is just going to go right through. So out of that original million, you might get 400,000 through. Out of the 4.3 million, you get 4.3 million through. So it's literally 10 times as much, even though your ISO multiplier is 4 times as much. 10 times as much actual hull damage is going to come from the ISO on that target. So particularly, obviously, a target without any ISO defense, but very few things out there have them. So if this is our crew setup, again, not a terrible one, but it certainly performs a lot worse. So we're going to we're going to kill it in 5 rounds. We're going to take 84 shots. Because we went so many more rounds, we've got a 90% crit rate. Cisco had an extra round to get up. Vale had an extra round to get the crit rate up. But our isolytic damage is a fair bit lower, 437. So it's only your innate plus the lower deck guys helping out here. And we're going to take 775 million hull damage in this fight. Another similar one that used to be like the crew for a long period of time is going to be 5-6 con. And the assumption behind a lot of this is very similar to the previous crew. You've got a lot of the same things here. 5 is going to, as her captain's ability, add mitigation, and she has synergy with 6. So she's going to give you some defense, and there's definitely some benefit to that. And she also gives a loot bonus as her officer ability. 6 is similar to Changel Kira, although a little bit on the flip side. Instead of lowering the defense of the target, it increases the penetration of your weapons. This makes it less collective. So Changel Kira benefits the whole group. So if there's 7 of you doing an armada, Changel Kira applies to all 7 people, whereas 6 applies only to your ship. So it's only going to matter on what you are doing and not everyone else. However, again, despite the fact that 6 used to be really good at doing this and can cut through the penetration of the target or the defense of the targets well, that's just not important anymore. Because so little of it is the normal damage and so much of it is the isolytic that you just don't need to do that. So it's basically a wasted officer there. And then con is there to add criticals. Con works a lot better when it's a longer fight as well, because the way that con works is per hit. So it's not a set amount per round like Cisco is. It is per hit that you get off and can go up to 5%. So over a longer fight, definitely works reasonably well, but in a short burst fight is a little less effective. And again, doesn't provide some of the other benefits that some of the other critical officers have, but still does okay. So if we look at this fight, we're again at 5 rounds with 84 shots taken. So same as the other one with Changel Kira. We've got a slightly lower crit rate, but we're still in the ballpark, 87.5. So some of that's from con, some of that is from our below deck officer. We only have the same ISO multiplier, 437%, but we've taken a lot more hull damage on our side. This is because 5 doesn't mitigate quite as much as Cisco does. So 5 with a 6 is going to be a 600% defense mitigation, and Cisco is at, I want to say 1,300 or maybe it's even 1,600. It's high. It's about 2.5 times higher than what 5's is. So if you're having any mitigation problems at all, Cisco is definitely the better way to go in terms of mitigating the damage that you're taking. But again, not absolute trash crew or anything, just kind of not relevant anymore because the penetration is not relevant anymore. And it's cutting into the amount of isolytic damage that you're going to put out in the fight. Another one that we're going to look at, and this is again trying to combine some of the old officers with some of the new things, trying to take advantage of some stuff like the extra shots, etc. That works out kind of okay, but is maybe not the optimal thing that you want. We've got Chakotay as captain. He provides extra shots as his captain's ability. He also then provides critical hits as his officer ability. Janeway is here, providing both isolytic damage, but also giving synergy to Chakotay's extra shots. So you're going to increase the amount of extra shots you get. By default, he's 40%. I think with the synergy, would get him up to 70%. And there's no randomness to that. He just gives you that percentage as an outright amount. There's no coin flip or anything to that. The other officer here, though, is Dajash, and she is also there for extra shots, but at least until you tier her much higher, is still a random officer. So I think her baseline, I forget if I've got her tier 1 or 2, but her has a percentage chance, let's say a 40% chance of providing 100% extra shots for 2 rounds, as opposed to Miles O'Brien's 3 rounds. And it's still a bit of a coin flip or a dice roll on whether you're going to get them or not. As you tier her up, the chance is going to go up, but now it only lasts 2 rounds instead of the 3. So it can't actually stack up to like that 300% that Miles potentially can. It's only going to be capped at the 200%. And again, it's random. So like you're going to get 100% half the time, as opposed to Miles, that's going to give you like on average 150 if you kind of play it out over time. But it's still pretty decent. We took 3 rounds to kill the target, 42 shots that we took. The crit rate in that same ballpark, Chakotay is pretty decent. Combined with the lower deck, we got a 90% crit rate. ISO multiplier of just over 600% when you've got Janeway on, and we took 601 million hull damage on average in the fights I did in this one. So again, pretty viable, works out okay. You're playing a little randomness with Dajash, but you're doing a similar thing with Miles too. But I think that Miles is, because he's 3 rounds, is going to be more consistent over time than she is. But as you tier her up, potentially her odds get better, so it may be a little bit of a trade-off there. Another alternative that we can look at is then kind of combining the 2 setups. So what if we stick Chakotay in for his extra shots, but don't give him synergy, take his crits, and then put Gwen for isolytic instead of Janeway. So we're giving up an extra 30% shots, but getting an extra like 50% ISO damage or ISO cascade in the situation. And then we're putting Miles for extra shots instead of Dajash. And in this case, we are now lasting, or I keep saying lasting, takes us 2 rounds to kill the thing. 21 shots that we've taken at a 77.4% crit rate. Again, that'll vary a little. But now our ISO multipliers back up to this 1,031%, and we are taking 295 million hull damage. So we're in that same ballpark of our damage output is definitely up there with the original Cisco, Miles, DeMarco crew, but we're taking a little bit more in this case because one thing Cisco was giving us was the extra mitigation, whereas now we don't have that. So more is going to get through our defenses a little more heavily, and we're going to take a little more damage, even though the length of the fight was ultimately the same. The fight should theoretically be a tiny bit shorter when you're using Chakotay, because you do have the 30% extra shots, but it's really on an edge whether that's going to matter or not. There's going to be specific situations where that extra kind of 0.3 is going to kill something around earlier, but in a lot of cases, as long as it still takes you the same amount of weapon fires, then you're going to take the same amount of shots from the Armada, in which case you're then going to be a little more defenseless and you're not going to do the same amount. So theoretically, the damage output from this is actually higher, but your defense is a little bit lower. So if you're judging it by the damage output, this is actually probably a little superior. If you are judging it by the amount of damage that you take and the survivability you have, this is a tiny bit worse, but they're definitely in the same ballpark. So these are definitely both viable crews. One that I've seen a lot, and I think it's kind of feels like people trying to cobble together, we've got new officers, let's try and use the new officers sort of situation, then combined with the fact that Dajash as a captain's ability gives extra loot, but not only that, Of course, if you add synergy to it, gives even more loot than that. So people have a tendency to want to put her as captain and then assign the 2 officers to her. In this case, obviously she's giving loot and the extra shots. Tully is lowering the mitigation of the opponent, but as we've discussed, that doesn't matter. So Tully is really only there providing the extra loot bonus to Dajash and doesn't actually help in the fight hardly at all, like a very, very marginal amount. Beer does add extra crit damage actually, and usually crit damage is good, but I haven't looked at exactly how that scales up, but on the numbers really low compared to what some of the other ones are in the below decks, where like my E-Troy is adding like 65% to it. Beer is adding like 5% a hit or something. It's kind of creeping up, and given that he's taking one of the more valuable spots that could be isolytic, it could be extra shots, it could be other things, it doesn't pay for itself. It's not doing enough damage output to make up for the fact that it's taking that sort of resources. And then none of this includes mitigation for ourselves or any extra benefits basically here. So this one is going to take us 5 rounds. We're going to take 84 shots. Our crit rate is 74%, so really only provided by the below deck officer, because none of these bridge officers are going to increase the crit rate. Our ISO multiplier is at the 438 or like whatever our base is with only the below deck officers. And we're now taking 1.32 billion hull damage. So because we've got no mitigation, we're now taking a ton more damage from fighting this thing over the course of the 5 rounds. And our damage per round output is just a lot less than it was. But the main reason I think people are doing this is because they see that it's going to give them extra loot. So yes, if you're on a completely trivial fight, then this may be something that you could do to get extra loot from it. But I'd almost say, why don't you switch to a better crew and fight a higher target instead of doing this? Because you basically, it's just worse. You're basically taking 8 times the amount of damage. You're doing a lot less damage output yourself. You're contributing a lot less, but you're just kind of going in to get the extra loot there. It's not terrible, but it's not good. It's not really a cutting edge crew or what you'd want to do. It's just kind of, so basically, if you're doing it for extra loot. You're not doing it to help. Then I wanted to just kind of compare that to one of just the old school crews. These officers have been around for like 5 years or whatever, if probably more than that. It's going to be Kirk, Spock, and Khan. So all this does is regenerate our shields. Kirk is going to provide morale, which you don't even need if you've got it below deck. And Khan is going to add to the crit. So I just kind of want to show a comparison between that and a super old school crew that basically doesn't help, but doesn't hurt all that much. In a 6-round fight, we took 93 shots. Khan has got us up to a 94% crit rate. Our ISO multipliers at the same 437, and we've taken 1.3 billion hull damage. So just again, to make that comparison between the two, it's at least going to keep our shield up, which is going to help a little bit with the mitigation so that our shield doesn't completely run out, which can help in a long fight. I still think this is one of the better crews for something like Eclipse Armadas, where their survivability matters a lot more than the damage output that you're doing. But basically, when you're running kind of that Tully Beer type crew, it's no better than Kirk, Spock, Khan in terms of the damage output and kind of your contribution to it. So it's in that sort of similar ballpark. Another one that is a decent option, but kind of pans out depending what you're fighting here and kind of misses some of the extra features from other officers that I see people use a bit, is Jean-Luc Picard, Beverly, and DeMarco. The reason for this is because Picard, when he is paired with a synergy officer, increases the output of another officer by 2.2, basically takes it and multiplies them by a bonus amount based on what their officer ability is. Beverly is there. She provides a bit of mitigation. So again, you've got some extra defense from having her on board. That's amplified by Picard itself. And also, but her main task is really to be providing that synergy for Picard. And the whole purpose of this type of crew is to really load up on DeMarco, to make now DeMarco 2.2 times as effective as she was, which is already very effective. So here we get a 3-round fight. We took 39 shots. We have a 71.4% crit rate. So again, just the below deck officer is helping out here. None of these ones do. But suddenly our isolytic multiplier is through the roof. We're now at 1,742% because Gwen is doing so much more than she used to be doing. And in this case, that strong ISO multiplier is going to keep the rounds relatively short. It's not our best one, but this certainly isn't the worst by far. We're taking 383 million hull damage from this crew. So I see people doing this a lot, and it's really going all in on DeMarco. But the thing that it's letting up on is, even though we've increased DeMarco from giving us an ISO of 1,030 to 1,740, I would actually still rather have the extra shots because they're just going to outright double my damage. So if I've got 100% extra shots, I do twice as much damage, just outright. So unless the ISO multiplier was so big that it was more than doubling, then I'd rather have the extra shots. Plus, I'd rather have kind of an extra crit rate on top of it. I'm giving up that 90-something+ % crit rate for 70. I'd kind of rather that 20% more of my shots critted in the first place instead of just loading up. So it's kind of, I've described it before as having kind of a damage cube, that you've got your base damage times the ISO times your crit rate and times the critical damage and the extra shots. Like, all of those things are multiplicative, and I'll show that with a good example later. But basically, all these things multiply and continue to go. And if you change one of those variables to make it bigger, but simply remove another variable, you've simply removed a whole column that you're multiplying it by, and now you're not getting any of those benefits. So unless the thing that you're increasing is more than you would have gotten from the other thing, then you don't want to be removing that. So again, not a horrible crew, but this, not the meta. And really, if you've got DeMarco, you probably have Cisco and Miles like maxed out a long time ago. So I think that's probably going to be a better one. So this is kind of what I was talking about with the multiplication. If you take the base damage of a ship and just do that, so just the situation where you've got like Next Gen Crusher as the captain and nobody else on it, then you're doing your basic damage. That's all that's there. If you throw Miles on that and you're doing extra shots, that's going to, on average, give you 1.5 times on top of your base. So basically, your base times 2.5. You then would add on your critical damage to that, modified by what percentage of the time you are criticaling against your opponent. So in my case, it's going to be about 1,400% critical damage that I'm getting. That contains two components to it. There's going to be the critical damage itself and whether or not your target has hull breach. So if you are at 900 and something % critical damage from your research and other things, and then you add hull breach to it, it's going to bring you up to about 1,400%. You can figure out what your own critical damage is depending on what your research is by looking at non-crit shots compared to your crit ones and seeing how much bigger they actually are. And then in the net, you're going to take the entire thing and multiply it by 1 plus the isolytic damage that you're doing. So in this case, if you just had that stock crew out there with nothing, no extra shots, no critical damage at all, no critical chance, no isolytic damage at all, nothing extra, it's going to be doing 1. Once you add in all these other factors that I have, basically with the best crew, I'm doing 458 times the damage that I would be doing if I didn't have any of that. Now, some of that is stock from the research that we have available anyway, so it's not contingent upon your crew. So it's not really that 1 to 458, but we can take a good example or a good look at what it actually is. So if I take a crew and put it on this cube. And once again, now I'm going to fight a target that's a little lower, largely because of warp range and what I want to do in the second part. But we'll walk through what this basically does. So here I've got a crew that's not really doing anything to help me with the Armada fight at all. I've got just nonsense below decks. This is a hostile grinding crew, basically. It's just a loot hostile grinding crew, and we're going to fight a level 62 Armada in Fed space. In this case, the cube basic stats are supposed to do 1.21 billion damage per round. That's never totally accurate, but that's approximately what it says it's going to do. So that's going to be our starting point. And you can see in this fight, yeah, I won it. I took a little bit of damage. It took 11 rounds to do it, but we just kind of overpowered it with how strong the ship is and eventually got the thing dead in 11 rounds. If we look at what the math is here, because I've got some innate things already, so in some of our previous tests, we were able to figure out what some of these values are. If I take the base damage that I have, which is the 1.21 billion, I'm going to multiply it by 1, which is just no extra shots. So the number of shots I have is just the number of shots I'm supposed to have. I don't have Miles, I don't have Dajash, I don't have Chakotay, whatever on here, so just multiply by 1. Then I'm going to multiply it by 1 plus the amount of isolytic damage that I do by stock. You could see earlier when I had nobody on there, my base isolytic damage was 336%. So we're going to take 436%. So 1, the normal damage, plus the 336 that we had. So multiply everything by 4.36. Then we also saw earlier, my normal crit chance is about 30%. It was like 29.6, 30.4, whatever. It's about 30%. So we're going to put that in, 30% chance to crit. And then that crit chance times my normal crit damage is about 940%. So 909.4. Basically. So we're not hull breaching. We're just going with the base critical damage, 9.4. Basically what this is going to give us is a multiplier of about 11 or 12, whatever this is. And we are at 14.7 billion actual damage per round. Again, this is very approximate. That's just kind of what it says on the ship. There's other things that may apply. You know, this increases damage versus this type of target, whatever, which we can't really account for. But this is approximately going to give us a ballpark of what's right. And when we compare it to the other ship, we're at least comparing apples to apples. So about 14.87 billion per round, and it took us 11 rounds in order to kill this thing. Now, this is the main point that I'm driving at. A lot of people, I think, still think in a way that is, how much power do we need to kill this target? Make sure there's 50 million power in this leg. Make sure that we have 30% of what it says on the target. Make sure that we need 10 billion power against this formation. Make sure we've got this percent, whatever. This ship has more power than this ship. Absolutely fucking irrelevant. Just not how it works at all. It's all about this extra stuff. The crew that you have, I would rather have a horrible ship crewed properly than a really, really strong ship crewed weakly. And I'm going to show a pretty extreme example in this case, which is going to be this Monavine, which is 379 million as opposed to the 12 plus billion power of the cube. It's obviously got way less hull, way less survivability, but we're going to fight the same target and work out the math the same way here. In this one, we start with 59.13 million, as opposed to billion, damage per round, and then we're going to follow through what that math would be. I've got Miles here for the extra shots. He's going to provide on average 150% extra, so we're going to multiply by 2.5. We've now got Gwen here for the isolytic damage. She's going to multiply by that 1031 plus 1 is going to be 11.31. We now know from this log that the crit rate, because this is a 5-round fight, is going to be 94.7%. So 94.7% of the time we critted, and when we critted, it hit for 15.6 times the normal damage of a shot. So that's because we've got hull breach, we've got that extra below deck crit damage. We're doing 15.6 times normal when we crit. And what this is working out to is 24.7 billion per round. And as you can see from the actual fight itself, we are killing it in less than half the amount of time than the cube took. So the math works it out to be that we're not quite double what it was. The actuality of how it plays out in weapon fire is this Monavine, crewed properly, did more than twice the amount of damage as a 12 billion cube that was not crewed properly. And that's the main point that I wanted to make. A lot of leaderboards out there are based on the amount of damage output that you are doing, and that's what's going to give you the position on the leaderboard. But also when you're trying to balance with the people in your alliance, this is the main point. The power on the ship, irrelevant. What matters is what's on there. That's what's going to multiply the power on the ship, multiply the damage that it does. The ship itself can at least speak to survivability. But there's more and more targets out there now that actually increase their power over time. So if you don't get something dead quick, things have a certain life to them. So the super weapons only last for 30 to 50 rounds. The Borg polycubes, you only get 20 rounds to fight it. If you're not pumping out damage, then you're going to fall behind. The fact that you can live 20 rounds doesn't matter, that you were never going to blow up. It's the fact that you're putting the damage output out to get the target dead in time. And a lot of them out there now increase something for each round. So they may do more isolytic per round. They may gain defense per round. They may fire extra shots per round as the fight goes on, is a pretty normal mechanic that started way back in like the Cardassian Armadas. Their crit rate went up for each round that they fought. So getting the damage front loaded out the door is what you really want to be focusing on. So that's kind of the main point I wanted to make with this. Hopefully that gives you some options for crews. If you don't have DeMarco, there's certainly alternatives to that. If you do want to focus on something that is more focused on officers that you do have, I think everyone probably has at least some combination of what we put together. And at least if all else fails, Kirk, Spock, Khan, I'm sure everybody has in some capacity or not. And it's never actually a bad decision to use that if you just don't have anything else to go with. But I wanted to show the extreme contrast between having a crew that was like a hostile crew or a loot crew versus something that was actually designed to kill these things. So next time you kind of see someone saying, how much power do we need, or how much, should we balance the legs of this formation by the amount of power? Look at what's actually on the crews of those ships. Encourage people to use the right things, kind of lead by example, make sure that you're bringing the right stuff. If somebody calls an Armada, go home, dock, change first, and then go to it, and you're going to contribute a lot better as opposed to just kind of taking up loot. And I've seen part of the reason this came up, I've seen a lot of people doing formations lately, and then they're like, oh, well, this leg killed us, but we had 10 billion power in it. How'd we die? Because you had a hostile grinding, you had Pike Moreau Chen on it. That's why you died. The ship is just a rock at that point. It doesn't do anything except absorb shots. It's barely doing any damage. So that sort of thing was what I wanted to get at. Hope this is helpful. If you've got any other crews that you kind of want an opinion on, I tried to what I actually did for the last 2 days. I just kind of looked at what other people were using for crews and tried to test a number of them or some of the combinations around them. So I wasted about 40 directives doing this, although most of them I won, so it was fine. But basically, if you have a crew that you want tested or you want an opinion on, at least drop it below, and let's talk about it and how it interacts. There's other options I know for the below decks as well. There's a few other combinations you can do that aren't that bad. I tried to pick a pretty generic, always good one, but like I said, you could swap in Tom Paris if you need mitigation. And in some of the ones where I said, there's no mitigation in the officers, you can make that swap out and it still works fine, that you're not going to take a lot of damage because of Tom, but it's not as good as some of the other things out there. So, There you have it. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.